Longest Day is a podcast from a female-founded destination practice that believes that crisis isn't an if, it's a when. We are an organisation unafraid of crisis, but have never known one to be resolved in a single day. However long the day or night that gave rise to the crisis in the first place, there's always something we can learn. I'm Leah, the founder and CEO of Broadstairs Consulting, a problem-solving consultancy offering crisis and governance advisory services to help leaders and organisations thrive and flourish. We operate in the gap between legal and public relations, at the coalface of difficult situations, believing that most crises are avoidable and the impact of inevitable ones usually can be mitigated. Our guests have overcome a litany of crises. Many of our guests have worked with us in some capacity in the past. All of them have stories worth hearing. We trust them to make this worth your while. We hope it helps you trust us. Tomiwa Owolade is a freelance writer, critic, and the author of This Is Not America, which is published by Atlantic and released on the 22nd of June 2023. He has written columns, essays, and book reviews for many publications, including The Times, The Spectator, The FT, Unheard, The Evening Standard, and Literary Review. He's a contributing writer for The New Statesman. In his book, he argues that too much of the debate about race in Britain has been viewed through the prism of American experiences and history that doesn't reflect the challenges and achievements of an increasingly diverse Black British population. His interests include identity politics, liberalism, social protest movements, and religion. He enjoys reading fiction and non-fiction books, watching films and TV shows, YouTube documentaries about 20th century dictators, and eating lemon cheesecake. Today, we are recording in leafy Enfield at the 40 Hill Estate, and it is a real joy to have him on the podcast. Well, Tomiwa, thank you so much for making time to join us on The Longest Day.
My pleasure.
I wonder if you might like to tell our listeners, what was your longest day?
My longest day was when I was 11 and tried to get into my school football team. So I should say that between the ages of 9 and 11, my one true ambition and goal and obsession in life was playing football. And my fantasy during that time was to move to Brazil when I turned 16 and learn Portuguese and play football and eventually play as an attacking midfielder or a striker for the Brazilian national team. My parents found this absolutely hilarious, but it was a genuine and sincere conviction. So when I turned 11 and went into secondary school, I tried to get into my year 7 football team, but I wasn't good enough to get into that team. And that was the first time I learned that my fantasy was only a fantasy and it could never be realized. I would describe that as the first truly devastating experience of my life. Looking back at it, I find it very funny, and I often tell it as a joke, but at the time itself, it was a genuinely devastating experience, that clash between fantasy and reality. So for a couple of days, I was traumatized. Might sound like a very dramatic term to use from hindsight, but at the time itself, I felt traumatized. But my parents were very supportive and very understanding, and I think that experience gave me resilience, and it also gave me a certain degree of perspective and a certain degree of pragmatism as well, which I think has influenced my much of my beliefs and much of my politics, in fact, because I think that seductive, as fantasies can be seductive, but the truly important things in life are the things which are grounded in reality. And I think though that experience of not being able to realize my fantasy of being a footballer was devastating, the experience itself made me a more pragmatic person and grounded me in reality. And I think that's definitely informed the way I look at life now.
How did your parents help you at 11 manage disappointment? Because that is a core life skill that I definitely don't have.
Yes. Well, they emphasized the fact that football was not the only thing I cared about. So they looked at it from an optimistic point of view, a point of view which stressed that there are other aspects of my life, other things in my life which I valued and cherished. For example, reading books. So when at around the same time that I was passionately interested in football, I was also interested in reading novels as well. At that time, young adult novels or children's novels, but also encyclopedias as well. I loved learning about the past. I loved learning random facts about science or history or geography. So I think what my parents did, which sort of brought me out of that traumatic experience, was emphasizing that I had other things that I could be passionate about and care about.
It's very clear that they successfully redeployed your energies. You're well renowned as a writer. You write predominantly for the New Statesman and obviously for many other mainstream newspapers. And you've written a new book that's coming out on the 22nd of June called This Is Not America, Why Black Lives in Britain Matter. Tell us how you became a writer.
So before I wanted to be a football player, I should give a more fuller perspective of my CV.
Please do.
Before I wanted to be a football player, I wanted to be a spy. But I recognized that my ambition to be a spy was generally a fantasy, whereas my ambition to be a footballer was a fantasy that I thought would be a reality. So after I realized I couldn't be a football player, later on I wanted to be a writer, a journalist, or a novelist, either one. A novelist because I enjoyed reading novels, and as you can tell from my ambition to be a spy, I had a very rich imagination. So it made sense to be a novelist or a writer of some sort. When I was about 13, I discovered this British-American writer called Christopher Hitchens on YouTube. And I loved watching his videos on YouTube, the way he debated with other people. So I wanted to be a journalist because I thought it was a cool job, reading, writing, debating, being engaged in intellectual life. And I think that's partly why I chose to study English at university. But when I was at university, I also developed more academic ambitions. So for a short while, I thought about going into academia. And in fact, I studied a master's in English as well, with the eventual goal of doing a PhD. But while studying my master's, I discovered that the academic style of writing was too rigid and quite boring, in fact, to read. So after my master's, I should say whilst doing a master's and whilst doing an undergraduate degree, I was also doing some blogging online. So the idea of being a writer was still there. So I had my own WordPress blog when that was still a thing. Now everyone's on Substack. But back then I had my own WordPress blog where I wrote about culture, politics, free speech, religion, race, various issues. But after my master's, for a short while, I worked as a tutor in English in a secondary school, whilst also doing some freelance writing on the side. But ever since I started working on This Is Not America, my book, I've worked full time as a freelance writer, and I think that's writing. I see writing journalistically as something that I will do for quite a while, even though long term, I would also like to do other kinds of writing, possibly writing fiction, possibly writing screenplays or plays or things more creative. But I see writing of any sort of variety as my long-term future.
This book is a clear demonstration of your passion for history, and divided into two parts. This is America, this is Britain, and is an insightful overview of the landscape on both sides of the pond. What is it that makes you unafraid to be somebody who writes about race in 2023 in contemporary Britain?
So I think I write about race from a very particular angle. And basically the reason why I wrote this book is that I wanted to offer a fresh perspective on race, which acknowledges the importance of context and which challenges some of the conventional narratives on race. And I think the reason why I do that is because I think one of the reasons is because I'm an immigrant. So I was actually born in Nigeria and I moved to the UK when I was 9. So I think I've always felt like an outsider, essentially. I didn't really belong to any particular clique when I was at school. I didn't, this was a very conscious thing on my part, because I've always resisted being put in a particular box, whether socially, ideologically, even racially, because I've always felt uncomfortable being put in a box. And being an immigrant, I think I've always approached things from an outside perspective, from the perspective of someone looking in, rather than the perspective of someone being absorbed into an in-group. And I think that's a big reason why I try to approach race from more oblique angles, more outside angles, more hopefully original and refreshing angles.
One might say that Britain's discourse on race is in crisis. Even mention of the word woke, and you have trembling, blood pressure rises, fuming. Who knows what the reaction is? What do you think the solution is to, I suppose, create a new narrative? I feel like your book is very hopeful.
Yes. I think so too. I think the solution is to approach issues like race in a good faith manner. So when the word woke is mentioned, it gets people aggrieved. And I think it gets people both, broadly speaking, on the right and also the left aggrieved, because when the right think about woke, they just view it as this existential threat to civilization. Whereas when woke is mentioned in the context of the left, they view it as a personal attack on their cherished values and beliefs in terms of tolerance and inclusivity. So I think the most important thing to create a better narrative, a more optimistic narrative, a more inclusive narrative, is that we approach these issues with a greater degree of good faith, rather than trying to stigmatize the other side, rather than trying to personalize good faith disagreement or debates. So when Malcolm X was assassinated in America, Martin Luther King made a very fantastic point. He said that we should be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And what I take that to mean is that we should be able to argue out many of these sensitive issues without also devaluing the humanity or denigrating the dignity of the people that we are disagreeing with. And I think that on the basis of that, on the basis of acknowledging that we have a shared humanity, or if we're arguing in Britain, that we have a shared overarching identity that transcends, hopefully, racial, social divisions, I think that should be the underlying principle upon which we can build a more inclusive and a more optimistic narrative on race.
I couldn't agree more, and it's certainly something that we try to do on The Longest Day. It's something we try to do as a consultancy is encourage people to disagree well and facilitate that. We'll be back after a short break.
It's hard not to feel disillusioned by the fashion industry. To get that piece you want, you either have to compromise your budget, compromise the product quality, or compromise your ethics. But we believe there's a better way. Positive Retail brings you second-hand designer fashion that offers more than just a new fit. Our goal is to categorically change customer perceptions of resale and provide joy, protect the planet, and create community. Find us in stores in Margate, Ramsgate, and Deal, and online at positive-retail.com.
That was Anna, founder of Positive Retail. Thank you. Let's pick up where we left off. Obviously, not everybody is able to disagree well, and we have cancel culture in the UK. And you also found yourself at the centre of a political storm with one Diane Abbott MP.
Yes.
How was that experience for you, and what did you learn?
That was a very strange experience for me. So I should say that I did not write that column with the intention of getting rid of Diane Abbott. That was definitely not my intention. I promise. I pinky promise. So it was genuinely surprising to me because when she made that comment, so for listeners that don't know the full context, I wrote a column the week before arguing that when we think about racism, we shouldn't only think about racism to Black and brown people. We should also acknowledge the fact that racism can affect certain ethnic minority people that are often racialized as white. So Irish people, traveler and Roma communities, and of course, Jewish people as well. That a week after I wrote that column for the Observer newspaper, Diane Abbott, the Labour MP, wrote a letter to the Observer arguing that though those white ethnic minority communities can experience prejudice, they can't experience racism. And the examples that she brought up to illustrate that point include the fact that Jewish people were not told to sit at the back of the bus during Jim Crow America, and Jewish people were not oppressed in apartheid South Africa. The counterexamples that many people brought up included one of the greatest genocides of the 20th century, the Holocaust, of course. So that was extremely surprising, not least because the constituency that Diane Abbott represents has one of the largest concentrations of Orthodox Jewish people in Europe. And also, it also has a very large Irish community as well. Being at the center of that storm was very surprising because, for one thing, I discovered that so many random radio producers and TV producers somehow had my phone number, which was a bit surprising. And but I should also say that I was only at the center of it for about 48 hours. So news cycles in the UK come very intensely, but also very shortly. The thing is, I'd never interacted with Diane Abbott before that, and we've never interacted since. So our relationship is still slightly mysterious. But I should also say that she did apologize very swiftly, which I think is one of the few good things to come out of that.
One of the things that I enjoyed about reading your book was the willingness to state the difference and the approach, the background, the context, the experience of Black Americans, African Americans, Caribbean Americans is markedly different to that of Black British, Black Caribbean, Black African. How did you define your language in terms of what Black means in the States and what Black means in the UK?
So the genesis of this book, and I mention it in the introduction, came about during the summer of 2020 when I became aware of an open letter that was sent to the English faculty of my old university, UCL, by the current students of that university. And in that open letter, they accused the faculty of racism against BIPOC people in the UK. And for those of you that don't know, BIPOC is an acronym, BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It struck me because I can understand why the indigenous part of that acronym makes sense in the context of America, because America has historically oppressed and discriminated against its various indigenous communities. But using indigenous in the context of the UK carries with it a more far-right resonance rather than a progressive agenda. So when people talk about protecting the rights of indigenous people in the UK, they mean indigenous white people. And they often say, let's protect the rights of indigenous white people against the invasion of foreign Black and brown immigrants. And that example made it absolutely clear to me, crystal clear to me, that all too often when we think about race, we internalize the American way of talking and thinking about race. And when we think about race, we need to do it from a British perspective. That was the first conclusion that I drew from that. The second conclusion is when we think about race from a British perspective, we also need to acknowledge that Black and ethnic minority people in the UK do not share the same experiences. The term BAME, B-A-M-E-E, is an unsatisfactory term because it tries to homogenize the various experiences of ethnic minority people, and it presumes that they share the same experience in terms of education, in terms of employment, and also in terms of the way that they interact with the criminal justice system. Evidence and data suggests the exact opposite. So in doing research for this book, I realized that the experiences of, say, a British Indian pupil or a British Chinese pupil is very different to the experiences of a British Black Caribbean pupil. And what also struck me is that the experiences of Black British people are not all the same as well. So the experiences of a Black Caribbean person is very different to the experiences of a Black African person. And if we even think of what it means to be a Black African British person, the experiences of, say, a Nigerian person is very different to the experience of a Somali person or a Congolese person. And I think if we genuinely care about the inequalities in our society, we need to be more specific in our focus. So it's inadequate to say, let's try and improve equality in society for BAME people, because then the question that needs to be asked is which BAME people in particular, because it's quite clear that Black Caribbean boys in particular are struggling in schools, whereas British Indian girls, to use an alternative example, are absolutely thriving in schools. So when we think about inequality, we need to be crystal clear in what we mean by it. And the only way to be crystal clear is by being very specific in our focus.
Obviously, journalism and publishing often come under fire for the lack of Black representation. What has been your experience of becoming a journalist and getting published?
It's been a varied experience. So I do think that publishing and journalism does have, for want of a better term, a diversity problem. But I think that one way to immediately improve the situation is by trying to improve the pay of journalism and publishing and trying to improve the prestige of those professions. So there's this stereotype or cliche of an ambitious African or Asian immigrant parent that wants their child to either study law or medicine or engineering.
That's why football was not on the cards for you.
Yes, that's partly why. That's partly why. That's another reason why. My dad wanted me to be a lawyer, by the way, but I think he's now happy with my career choice. But that stereotype does bear a great degree of truth. So if you look at a profession like medicine or even law or even increasingly finance, there is a far greater degree of diversity in those professions than in the arts sector or in journalism. And I think one of the key reasons for why that is because many ambitious immigrant parents are encouraging their children to pursue those professions because those professions, frankly, pay better. And if you come from a family with very little intergenerational wealth, there is a greater incentive to pursue a profession that pays better than pursuing a profession that pays very poorly. So I think when we talk about diversity in publishing and the art sector and journalism, the big elephant in the room is class. So I think class needs to be a better way of looking at it rather than just looking at it through the lens of race.
I think that's really helpful. And you do explore the implications of the class system in Britain at length in your book. So absolutely worth a read. We at Broadstairs Consulting think food tells us a lot about people. And I know it was a long time ago, but if you had to live your longest day again, what food would you choose to help you feel better?
So the food that I did choose wasn't really food. It was some snacks. It was sweets and chocolate as a way to sort of stave off my depression. But the genuine answer I would have chosen would be Nigerian food. I say Nigerian food, but there isn't really anything called Nigerian food. It's a sort of West African continuum, which Nigerians, as good Nigerians know, like to claim is the best. So either jollof rice, Nigerian jollof rice is the best jollof rice, by the way, better than Senegalese or Ghanaian. It's just an objective fact. Either jollof rice or a Nigerian dish called eba, which we usually take with a stew containing either meat or chicken. So a Nigerian dish, either one of those, which would be cooked by my mum, because I think when your mum cooks it, it always tastes better. It's a mystery. I can't explain it. It always tastes better when your mum cooks it. There's just a mysterious maternal connection that goes on, which I find fascinating.
Extra love baked in.
Exactly, extra love.
Oh, I love that. That's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to your book flying off the shelves next week. Thank you for giving me the privilege of being able to read it early. And obviously, we've loved having you on The Longest Day. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to a Broadstairs Consulting Limited podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Tune in soon to hear the next instalment of The Longest Day. Copyright 2023. Production copyright Broadstairs Consulting Limited. All rights reserved.